There's not going to be one capital allocation mechanism that works for everything. We're more inventing like a toolbox. Just like when you want to fix a problem in your house, you don't say like,
Oh, I'm a screwdriver maxi. I have to use this one tool.
you say,
No, I'm going to use like pliers or screwdrivers or a saw, depending on what my problems are. And I think that like there's going to be like a dozen.
Yeah, I don't think we're converging anytime soon or maybe ever towards best solutions.
it's kind of like trying to engineer a thing that I wished existed when I was starting Gitcoin and I was just stumbling around in the dark alone, like building crowdfunding tech.
Yeah, I think the biggest learning I've had, especially from building DOrg over the years, was starting. And there's this like urge amongst, mechanism nerds to fix all the world's problems. There has to be one core interesting thing to set something apart and make it, succeed. But there shouldn't be multiple really interesting things. And this is another problem, is like projects that try to innovate on like multiple different vectors at once.
I think that that's a great point. Innovating where your core strength is, and hopefully that's a high leverage point that the market cares about. What I'm trying to do with Allo.Capital is create a Schelling point or like an attractor for the best builders. And I think that like my ideal case is that if you're a builder that's building one of these systems, we can accelerate you with intelligence, distribution for your mechanism, capital, and like networking with the other people that are in the scene. And so I think that we're creating like an attractor at like the economic and social and technological level that allows people to just move faster by virtue of being a member of the network. And welcome to the Allo.Capital podcast, powered by the Green Pill Network. If you're just joining us this season, we are summoning Allo.Capital, a new spin out from Gitcoin that is designed to build the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet. I think there's big upside here. Capital allocation is a multi-trillion-dollar design space, and VCs, governments, NGOs, and DAOs all have to allocate capital to survive and thrive. But it's also a place where we can start small. Every time you spend money, you are allocating capital. We are threading a through line, partnering with builders, researchers, and funders to figure out what on-chain capital allocation will look like, building it on-chain, and then iterating from there. If you want to learn more, you can visit our website at Allo.Capital, where you can download the Allo Books for free, play with some of our dApps, join the Telegram, or participate in the DAO. All right, my guest today is Ori Shimony. Ori leads the Mechanism Institute, which is a research hub advancing on-chain mechanisms to improve human institutions. He is also a research fellow at the Ethereum Foundation, exploring underexplored on-chain use cases. Previously, he co-founded DOrg, the first service DAO, and legally wrapped DAO, and co-authored the DAO model law, which is now enacted in multiple jurisdictions. I've been an admirer of Ori from afar for many years. I think that the Mechanism Institute is a really great mapping of all of the different capital allocation or governance mechanisms that are possible on chain. And so it's been a real delight to get to know Ori over the last quarter or two and explore the synergies between on-chain capital allocation, my work, and his work at Mechanism Institute. And I think that we're kind of independently converging on some similar ideas, which is always fun when that happens. And so in this episode, we kind of play jazz on top of his work on the Mechanism Institute, and then inject a little bit of Allo.Capital, and then swirl it around. And I think it's a really fun conversation to listen to if you're a impact nerd or a mechanism nerd or someone who just wants to understand where this space is going. So without further ado, I think you are going to enjoy this episode with Ori. Hey, Ori, how's it going?
Going well. How about you?
Pretty good. Glad to have you here. I think that we've been discussing mechanisms over the last couple months together, and excited to foreground that discussion in front of people who've been following Allo.Capital. So why don't you tee us off with an introduction of yourself, and then also would love to hear about Mechanism Institute.
Sure. So I've been researching on-chain mechanisms as long as I've been working. I got started trying to build DAOs on Bitcoin in 2015. And then shortly after Ethereum launched, I got into Solidity, realized it was a far more efficient way to build unstoppable systems than building different networks on top of Bitcoin, and quickly got into the DAO space and basically worked on DAOs for several years. I started DOrg in 2018 with some other developers. So we were this on-chain services DAO, still runs today. And through that process, I also had to figure out a lot of the non-technical sides of having mechanisms interface with the real world. And so we actually were the first in the US to legally incorporate our DAO. So we worked with lawyers to like figure out how to do that. And then various other things over the years of tracking reputation, incentivizing good quality work, sales, recruitment, marketing, all the kind of different things that go into running an organization and trying to do as much as possible on chain transparently. And so, yeah, in that process, I learned a lot about legal sides of crypto and participated in some efforts to make DAOs more legible to the legal system. And fast forward to today, I'm now generally focused on mechanisms, not just DAOs. I've also worked on public goods funding mechanisms like DAO Drops, and now I'm hanging out with the Allo crew and working on different allocation mechanisms. And basically, this culminated in me creating this library of on-chain primitives that help to kind of conceptualize the full design space. So that's what the Mechanism Institute is all about, is helping people understand this wide design space of on-chain mechanisms, understanding that they can help with a variety of things. They can help with allocation, with governance, with rewards and penalties. And at the same time, I'm also a research fellow at the Ethereum Foundation, where I'm helping explore kind of the under-attended to use cases that Ethereum can enable in the long term beyond the kind of current focus of the ecosystem on these like highly financial games.
Yeah, I remember the two areas where I think things overlap for us and that I'm just excited to talk about is when I found out about DAO Drops, which was Diorg's, I think, retroactive funding round. I was just really exciting, and I think I did an episode with Magenta and someone else from Diorg that I can't
And me.
remember. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yep.
And just really great to see the plurality of providers of retro funding. And then also, I've got mechanism.institute, your website up, and it's just a beautifully well curated registry of all the different mechanisms out there. And wondering if you want to tell us about either of those experiments.
DAO Drops was definitely a fun experiment. That was when retroactive funding became a topic with Optimism's round one, I think around 2022. And then shortly after, we did DAO Drops, which tried to make it like stupid simple for people to nominate one another and then be eligible for funding, because a big, complaint with public goods is the kind of administrative steps to apply. So we made some clever kind of like design tweaks there. And yeah, with Mechanism Institute, it kind of got started at Zuzalu 2023, where I was presenting and running workshops on mechanisms and just realized that people all had a different, let's say, siloed understanding of mechanisms. You have like the governance nerds, you have like the public goods nerds, you have the DeFi heads, you have all these different, groups. And obviously they'd all see smart contracts as this powerful tool for unbreakable agreements that can compose with one another, that are transparently executing. But I realized there wasn't like a really robust mapping of the design space. And so it started with an Airtable database that I, made public, and then gradually we made improvements over time as people really found it useful and would ask more questions. We basically improved the ontology, the taxonomy of mechanisms, added more descriptions to each of them, examples, and then also have done other kind of like research efforts with other orgs like Gitcoin and like the Zuzalu hackathons that we participated in over the years. Basically to bring the whole mechanism, the on-chain mechanism space into one unified kind of ontology. And so we can get more into that as we go. But I think basically the exciting part for me is that on-chain mechanisms are a new design space that is powerful. And we've only started to like shine the flashlight around in the dark cave and started to like understand little bits and pieces, but we don't have like a systematic understanding in the same way that maybe architects do, right? Architecture has hundreds, if not thousands of years of practice behind it, and principles and schools of thought, textbooks. We're not really there yet with the digital realm of designing digital structures. Only recently do we get this superpower of immutability that actually lets us build digital spaces, digital structures that have longevity, that don't just turn off the moment a company goes out of business. This is quite new.
Well, I'm wondering if we could talk about the why before we talk more about the mechanisms themselves. So like, why does this space animate you so much? Why does it give you so much energy? How come it seems like it feels alive for you? Could you
Mm.
say why it feels so important?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I always had a frustration with the templates that were handed down to us of how we could do things. Here's here's a university, here's a labor union, here's a political party, here's a corporation, here's a nonprofit. We have these kind of rigid templates for coordinating activity, and they're pretty good for the most part, but they also have these like huge failure modes and high friction and high bureaucracy needed to make them work. And ultimately, a lot of them rely on the state. They're very like embedded into the legal kind of ontology. They're embedded into the enforcement of the state at the end of the day to enforce the contracts that underpin those agreements. And why I get animated about on-chain mechanisms is because they blast open that design space. So instead of having like a dozen or so very popular templates, we now have full programmability. So we can coordinate for different kinds of things that have fallen through the cracks of those templates, of which I don't have to go through the list. We all know there's many problems in our world, many market failures, many governance failures. And so I think the exciting part about on-chain mechanisms it just kind of opens the Pandora's box to get creative about how to structure the way that we execute different kinds of agreements together. And we can do so without the heavy, bureaucratic, expensive kind of state edifice as the enforcement mechanism. Instead, we have the lighter weight consensus engine of blockchains.
I remember saying in the Allo books when I first wrote them last year that the old ways of allocating capital are inefficient, bloated with administrative overhead, and not democratized. And now, because we have global, transparent, incorruptible, programmable money, we can program our values into our money. We can build networks that are more democratic, efficient, effective at allocating capital. And I'm definitely feeling like like we're grasping the same elephant in how we're deciding or how we're describing this design space. It feels like the opportunity to fund public goods without the state in the most reductionist form, like it's just a really big design space because trillions of dollars go through the state and there are trillions of dollars worth of public goods and it's not really being effectively spent. So that's what animates me about this design space, and it's cool that multiple people have sort of like independently discovered the power of this, and now it feels like there's a groundswell of enthusiasm. I mean, maybe I'm just hanging out with mechanism nerds, but yeah, do you want to riff on that at all?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think it kind of dovetails nicely with what's going on in the non-crypto world. You have like Doge and a lot of excitement around cutting government waste and a lot of controversy, let's say, excitement and fear, uncertainty, doubt. And so, but I think that generally there's this recognition that the way that things have been done just don't make sense anymore, or they've gotten bloated and corrupted beyond repair. And so I think it's great that there's efforts to reform from the inside how those things work. But yeah, then there's those of us that realize that you can actually just think in terms of build it entirely anew and then run experiments, have it be voluntaristic. And over time, that can spread and have a network effect and then eat the cake of the current incumbent kind of structure for public goods funding and other kinds of coordination, governance, fundraising, etc.
Yeah, it feels like we're building a parallel society upon which some of the load that's been borne by the state over the last couple years, well, couple centuries could be transferred over. And I think that one way that I sort of frame it is like a fourth turning thing, like the institutions that were built 4 generations ago around World War II are starting to collapse or atrophy. And now we have the internet age. So we're moving from the industrial age to the internet age. But I also have a lot of trepidation when I think about this, because when I think about how existential the systems that we take for granted on are like air traffic control, like I don't know that Web3 systems are ready for controlling our nuclear devices and like
Hmm.
I think that it's a little bit of a LARP right now to say that we're building a parallel
Oh yeah.
society that can replace existing institutions, and we only are starting to like lay down the scaffolding for how some of most basic systems could be moved over. not even starting to even think about the most existential systems that we've probably all taken for granted. So, what's your response to that?
Yeah, I think about that all the time. Like we're in our little bubble working on these like very particular problems, and we're making big claims about how it's going to change everything and replace everything. And then I walk into an airport and I'm like, this is the most sophisticated coordination system I could possibly fathom, and no one person probably
Yeah.
understands the full depth
And
of.
existential, the error rate of,
It does
air
pretty
traffic
well.
control has to be as close to fucking zero as you can get.
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely think it's like the way I think of it, if we zoom out, is we're in the early innings of a civilization wide transition from the industrial mode of production into this networked mode of production. And so that's going to take at minimum like 100 years to fully work itself out. And so, yeah, I think we shouldn't be disheartened if we don't feel like we can get the error rate down to the same extent that the air traffic controllers have. But there'll be, I think, hybrids along the way. And then eventually, yeah, maybe fully networked isn't always going to be possible. But I think that the underlying like logic that shapes the power in those systems can be, more networked and more fair, right? Like based on contribution and not necessarily just like where people were born. I mean, one to make this more concrete, I think you and I both experienced the enthusiasm of DAOs and then also the, you know, disillusionment uh, valley that kind of the space is in now. And where I've come away with that is think is really realizing like, okay, yeah, there is a lot that can be done in smaller groups, more top down. But so that just makes me think differently about where the decentralization and the basically like networking of power can be pushed so that the sophisticated stuff can still happen in those kind of maybe top down small cells, but the system as a whole isn't like highly concentrated in the ownership. So for example, I think corporations have this pretty well figured out, which is you have like the C-suite, and then you have the board of directors that represents the shareholders, who basically controls who's on the C-suite for the most part. And so I think we can come up with way more sophisticated versions of that, where you still have like the professionalized group of actors, like the air traffic controllers, who know what they're doing and they don't need to be voting and like staking. But maybe you have the voting and staking that's controlling um, the high level parameters of the system, like yeah, value flows being a big one.
Yeah, so I think what I hear in that is, like, don't decentralize everything. Like, we don't have to be decentralization maxis. We should use it where we need to decentralize power and resource flows. Like, start with why decentralize before going into how to decentralize.
Totally. And I would say I'm an on-chain maxi, but not a decentralization maxi. I still think we can try to do more and more on-chain. And as we figure out how, a system should be built and we test it, I think it's really valuable to do things on-chain, but that doesn't mean they need to be fully decentralized, right? You can have like permissions baked into smart contracts, which all
Yeah.
the most popular on-chain systems have that, basically make them safer. And definitely in the short term, medium term, training wheels for L2s, time delayed execution for governance upgrades of DeFi protocols. There's mechanisms that basically let you get that more granular control, but still have things getting the benefits of being on chain, open, extensible, composable with other systems and whatnot.
I'm excited about this next question because I think you've probably thought about this a lot, and I have too. How do you think about the design space of on-chain mechanisms? So like, for me, like if I was to draw a map of on-chain mechanisms, I could look at, I could look at like centralized to decentralized. I could look at when they were invented in the chronology of time. I could look at, are they voting mechanisms or distribution mechanisms or some other type of mechanisms? Like, have you developed a taxonomy for the different Legos that you're coming up with? And, what is your go-to way of thinking about the design space of on-chain mechanisms?
Definitely. So the way we've done this at Mechanism Institute over time is inductively. We started with the mechanisms and then over time refine and refine the taxonomy and went through kind of several revamps where we're kind of like threw it all away and kind of try to totally come up with it again. And yeah, the most elegant that we have now is to think about it in terms of functions. So what problem are these types of mechanisms trying to solve? And right now we have 7 kind of different functions. I can go through them. And yeah, for me, they work really well as like a irreducible minimum. I think, maybe talk to me in a year and they'll have been tweaked again a little. So, we're not at the end state. But one way of thinking about it is a mental model. I'll go through the 7, but I think the mental model is like almost like the life cycle of a system. And so, a system needs to, in many cases, be capitalized. The system needs to make decisions, right? Or be governed, right? The system needs to allocate. The system might need to capture value. So yeah, I'll go through each one of those, but the life cycle is really like how I like to think about it. And and yeah, some of them are inter-system mechanisms, right? Like exchange mechanisms aren't necessarily exchange doesn't necessarily go on within a system, but maybe between systems. When I say system, this could just be a firm or an individual. Yeah. Yeah, the seven that as we have them right now are fundraising, which solves the problem of how can the system be bootstrapped? How can it raise capital? Then allocation. So now that you have this set of resources, you need mechanisms to allocate them. Value capture, which is how do stakeholders that maybe capitalize the system or provided other value to the system extract value for themselves outside of that system. Fourth is governance. That kind of explains itself. Maybe there's some aspects of that system that aren't fully autonomous and need to be decided upon. That's where governance mechanisms come in. Next, we have rewards and penalties. So this is how do you incentivize actors, disincentivize those actors, get the kind of behaviors that the system wants. And sixth is exchange. And so this is what I was talking about of kind of taking place between actors in a system, or maybe a system is facilitating individuals to exchange in different ways. This is, AMMs, for example, order books and bonding curves, various ways of swapping items of value. And lastly is data. And so data, I think of this as how information can be managed in a system. And so identity is important as a data primitive. But there's other, facets to that. There's other type of mechanisms like verifiable credentials and proof of personhood being a more specific version of identity, whereas identity can be for other things like organizations. So yeah, that's the rant on the mechanism ontology as it currently stands.
Yeah, it's beautiful. One of the things that I've been doing recently is taking like big brain ideas and laying them out visually and mimetically so that people can understand them on social media. Or like we have this poster that we made of like resource
Right.
allocation over time, how people used to allocate resources when they were in small groups of 25 or less hunter gatherers, and then how that evolved as we went to agricultural, industrial, and then information age. And like, I don't know, I was just imagining in my head the sort of like shape rotation of all of these different categories and how they fit and overlap with each other. And it's almost like as an engineer, these are all the different parts that I could install in a system. And it's in the combination of them that we're going to build some really fucking cool shit. And that's where I get really exciting is like, if we can educate the entire topology, make it navigable to people, then that's just going to increase the surface area of the cool stuff they can build.
Totally. Yeah, we definitely want to go into the visual direction, both at the individual mechanism level and totally at the function level. Yeah, I really do think of it like a hyperspace, right? Where, choose your combination and then any system could kind of be described and as like a point in this space almost. And there's trade-offs within each function. For example, with fundraising, you could go very like small and closed versus very open and permissionless. And there's different trade-offs to navigate as you choose which type of fundraising mechanisms your system has, if any at all. And yeah, so any given system, I think about as having maybe at least 2 or 3 of the different functions represented, but there's no hard and fast rules. So they could have all of them. They could have one of them.
Have you heard of assembly theory at all?
No, I don't think so.
So it's basically like a way of explaining every object in the universe as the history of its components, like recursively down to just atoms and electrons. And so basically like assembly theory thinks about how complexity and innovation emerges by combining similar components through incremental steps. So like I actually recently read a book that they could explain all physical components as the history of their subcomponents, and then like you can recursively do it over time. But I think that it's an elegant way of thinking in the blockchain space because we have these very basic primitives, ERC20, ERC721, smart account wallets we're starting to get. And then we're also starting to think about pattern language of these capital allocation tools. And I think of the design space as all of the permutations of all of the different mechanisms that you talked about and all of their subcategories, what is possible to be built from an assembly perspective, given each of those components. And I've been sort of like trying to spelunk up and down the assembly index. Assembly index is just like how complex is something. So like an ERC20 is like a complexity index of 1, whereas quadratic funding is a complexity index of like 25 or something like that. And so as we start to compile more basic primitives, then we can build things further up the assembly index stack. And I just think that it's exciting to think about and to try to think about that ontology of different things that can be built, and to sort of imagine 5 or 10 years in the future, we're going to be so much more advanced than we are today because we just keep accumulating more and more things that we can assemble there.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up pattern languages, and I think that I now know what you mean by like assembly theory a little bit more. And I was very inspired by this idea of pattern languages. Basically, I think it was coined by Christopher Alexander, an architect in the 70s. And yeah, basically, I mentioned architecture earlier. It's very much an inspiration of looking at the different patterns in use. And I like this thing he does where he starts with the largest possible pattern. So I guess in assembly theory, it would be the like a high index of complexity, like a nation or like the world, right? And then he goes successively lower up until he's talking about like the sink in your kitchen or a garden or even like the shelves on the wall, right? So the book is pretty trippy and going in these like full on scaling down to the lowest possible level of primitives. And I think the same way about mechanisms. Totally, like you said, we have tokens, we have quadratic funding, way more complex, and that's what the library tries to do is put everything for now side by side. Of here's an ERC20 transferable token, here's quadratic funding, but that's another kind of level of new dimension that I think would be cool to add visually. Is then scaling up and down. It's like, okay, here's the base building blocks, and here's like systems that are composed of multiple building blocks. And then, you could basically go up and down these scales and then mix and match primitives and systems to then create your own new composites.
We're actually kicking off a project for Allo.Capital this quarter of a pattern language for on-chain capital allocation. And I'm realizing as you're speaking that we should compare notes, or, so maybe I'll hook up something there. But one of the things I think is cool about this space is that I think we're both like doing our independent like intelligence gathering and mapping of the space. But if we work together, we're just only going to go faster. It's like a network good where the more it's shared, this knowledge, the faster we all go. And that just makes me so bullish. It's like a total 3-3.
Yeah, which is why I'm hyped to be doing the Allo.Capital research together. We can get into that as well.
So maybe I'll bend the episode a little bit towards Allo.Capital in 5 or 10 minutes, but I had a couple more questions about Mechanism Institute and just your thoughts on the design space before we get into that. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
What are the most interesting and especially underexplored mechanisms in your mind?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot in governance that has yet to be kind of fully fleshed out. There's a paper that was written by Daniel Kronovit probably 5 or 6 years ago called Against Voting, about these kind of computational governance mechanisms like pairwise. And I think that there's a lot more in this kind of space of algorithmically outputting decisions based on lots of different signals and kind of taking this more cybernetic approach to governance rather than a lot of what we've seen.
Do you think that's important because we have governance fatigue, or just because we're starting to realize the value of networks that give off emergent metadata exhaust, or both, or something else?
Definitely both. And I think I would add incentives. Like, I think right now that governance is treated as this altruistic, or rather there's an incentive problem of collective action. If I own 0.1% of the tokens, do I really care enough to vote? Is that really going to make a difference? And so I think that you can think more about like incentives of actors to emit valuable information, valuable signals, and that could be like baked into these kind of cybernetic decision making algorithms. And yet, governance fatigue, I think, is definitely a side effect of this, because if I don't have like a strong reason to participate for my own self-interest, then it's going to be tiring to like look every week at all the proposals. But yeah, even if I do have a strong self-interest, that's still just tiring. So that's a problem in itself. And also in the realm of kind of governance mechanisms, some of these wouldn't, you wouldn't necessarily initially think of it as governance, but basically like one concept I like to think about is like an aggregation controller. So in cybernetics, use these concepts of controllers that like take different inputs and generate different outputs. And aggregation controller is this one example of it is in 1inch's V1 governance. They have this program called instant governance, where instead of voting on parameter changes, all the stakers were saying what they want the parameters to be. And in real time, it was taking a token weighted average of all of those and setting that as the parameter of the system. And so I think these kinds of things are interesting, where in real time, the values are updating. And this works with allocation as well, where in real time, people signaling preferences about, how valuable they think different outputs are that could update the amount of like funds being streamed to them. Another cool kind of like dynamic governance mechanism that I like to think about is Bitcoin's difficulty adjustment, or Ethereum's gas markets, right? Where the base fee changes. It's basically this moving average that's constantly changing in response to like block times or gas usage of the last, let's say, 10, 20 blocks. And in that way, nobody has to necessarily vote to, you never have voting in Bitcoin. And yeah, I think this is a powerful design pattern to follow. And I really am a fan of governance minimization and basically trying to like control different outputs of systems through these dynamic inputs.
Yeah, it feels like very reductively we're moving from democracy being defined in a like industrial sense where you have like a bunch of people who are delegated and voting and like their job is to be like in the democracy, to more of like a networked epistemology where we're just measuring what the organic actors are doing and then generating collective intelligence from those signals. So it's almost like upgrading from an industrial era to like a networked era epistemology of how consensus is formed.
100%. Yeah. And I think then the same goes for beyond governance, like value capture and allocation. Like, you and I have talked about a lot, where you don't need these discrete kind of connections between input and output of, yes, let's give this person $1,000, or yes, let's give out these dividends to the shareholders. But instead, these things could be like dynamically outputted from the system's just day-to-day functioning without like a human having to like explicitly signal something or to come to an agreement with other humans to make those actions.
Yeah. And then you get into more like complex or like reflexive ways where the system and the individual interact with each other. I'm thinking of quadratic funding here, where like I give $1 and the project gets $100, dependent on how many voters it has. But not only is quadratic funding the way it works to like getting an input of like funding and then using that as an output, but it reflexively affects the other inputs in the system that creates like a groundswell of support for different projects or Sybil attacks, depending on whether you're cynical or optimistic about quadratic funding. But that reflexivity loop where like the matching amount affects the inputs and it is itself an output, I think is like an interesting attribute of these systems as well.
Yeah, I like the concept of stigmergy, of the signals that different actors leave in the environment affect the other actors that are navigating that environment. So I think quadratic funding is a great example of this, where I make this micro action, it affects what that project is getting, but it also affects what other people are seeing and then influences what they give to. And they never have to explicitly have a meeting and decide and coordinate, say like, we like this, we don't like this, but just the system is set up so that the different signals they leave can like result in an overall collective outcome.
Yeah, they kind of coordinate by mutating their environment. When someone explained, it was Kirk Dameron from Consensus that explains Sigmergy to me, and he said it's basically coordinating without making decisions together. And the example is like an ant colony. When they find food, the worker ants will leave a trail of pheromones so that the rest of the ants know to go find the food, and they'll just like sort of sigmergically explore the area around the nest, and then lay down pheromones that says, "Oh, there's threat to us over here." And there's food over here. And they do that without having any sort of like language in the sense that we would know, but just by laying down pheromones as they explore the design space. So I know that's how Sigmergy was explained to me, but it's interesting to see it translated into a mechanism design context on chain.
Yeah, yeah, and I saw it in the first place applied to open source, just like FOSS generally, and using the ant colony analogy, I definitely agree. Like the way that open source develops, I think that very much uses these principles of commits, pull requests, the discussions, and then bringing those into the on chain space where we have to be very intentional about how we design things. I think that's really valuable.
Okay, so let's start bending towards Allo.Capital and the design space of on-chain capital allocation. Um, when I did my episode with Vitalik in December, he said, good capital allocation is a problem that must be solved. And so I'm wondering, how do you think we solve it? Obviously, that's a really big question, and there's a ton of surface area there. But like, what are the high leverage points? How do you think that we solve this? What experiments are you excited about? And yeah, let's start moving from like theory into action. Like,
Sure.
where do we start?
Well, one, I definitely like one of the projects that came out of that, which is deep funding that you guys have been spearheading, where that you basically have like this dependency graph and weights assigned to the dependencies that different AI agents can come up with, and human judges. This kind of melding of human and machine, I think, is quite powerful for scaling our intelligence.
This is a methodology that's not failed me yet. Is just follow Vitalik around and pick up his brain droppings and turn them into products. QF,
That
retro funding, and deep funding hasn't failed me
never
yet.
fails. Yeah, like if it's not broke, don't fix it. Like, yeah, exactly. We don't have to come up with anything. Let's just call them up. But yeah, I think that the AI stuff has been definitely one of these big rabbit holes. I spent most of the last year and a half on AI agents and how they can interface with mechanisms. Because if humans aren't the actors and AI agents are, maybe intelligence and context, go down a bit, but you can scale like a pretty decent like judgment very cheaply.
Okay, so fund public goods with AI, that was kind of like if you want to compose your cart on Gitcoin, it's more of like an LLM experience for composing your cart where you say like, I want to fund climate projects or personal sovereignty projects, and then it goes and it finds the projects with that. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
And the idea is that you could hook an agent like that up to a DAO's treasury for it to make decisions on behalf of the collective of what they want to allocate. In that case, it was for an individual to make a cart to, make a donation. But yeah, you can apply the same principle at an ecosystem level, which I think is what deep funding is trying to do, right? Where I guess the Ethereum ecosystem wants more intelligent ways to allocate funding to the different dependencies that are powering Ethereum.
Yeah, so I think that, like, the question I asked you was, how do we solve for this design space? And then I think we went, like, deep on AI and deep funding, which is just kind of fun. But I kind of think I'm of the increased opinion that there's not gonna be one capital allocation mechanism that works for everything. We're more inventing, like, a toolbox, and we're gonna just like when you wanna fix a problem in your house, you don't say, like, "Oh, I'm a screwdriver maxi, I have to use this one tool." You say, "No, I'm gonna use, like, pliers or screwdrivers or a saw depending on what my problems are." And I think that like there's going to be like a dozen or like 2 dozen capital allocation mechanisms that together could compose almost everything a DAO would need for resource allocation for it. And so it's that pluralistic nature of this design space that I think that I'm excited about. And maybe like deep funding is a power saw, but like what are the adjacent tools around it? So would you agree that it's a plural design space and there's going to be many important tools that are discovered in the design space?
Yeah, I don't think we're converging anytime soon or maybe ever towards best solutions. I think the needs of humans inherently change. Not only are they highly complex and like diverse, but they also change. And so yeah, we're not gonna like converge on something that works well. I think, for example, the legacy system tried to converge, let's say, around our parliamentary democracy and whatnot, and obviously that's not working anymore for the most part. And so I think in the digital network realm as well, like the constant will be change. And so AI is definitely interesting for bridging the gap, the subjectivity gap and data processing gap for specifically like governance and allocation. I think it's powerful, but there's other you know mechanisms or principles that can also be powerful or be more powerful in different contexts, like prediction markets being a big one.
What I'm trying to do with Allo.Capital is create a shelling point or like an attractor for the best builders. And I think that like my ideal case is that if you're a builder that's building one of these systems, we can accelerate you with intelligence, distribution for your mechanism, capital, and like networking with the other people that are in the scene. And so I think that we're creating like an attractor at like the economic and social and technological level that allows people to just move faster by virtue of being a member of the network. And, maybe we were the first funders of these things. If I'm ever able to raise a fund for this thing, we'd be the first funders of the builders. And like, it's kind of like trying to engineer a thing that I wished existed when I was starting Gitcoin and I was just stumbling around in the dark alone, like building crowdfunding tech. Yeah, I think that like that's not the way we solve capital allocation, but I think that's a way that we can accelerate the people who are trying to solve capital allocations. That's like my high leverage point that I've found for designing an attractor that can help people solve for this design space. And by the way, like this podcast, if you're listening to it, is a form of intelligence capital that is produced by Allo.Capital. And I don't know, I guess like you've been kind of riding along shotgun and submitting a couple DAO design proposals for Allo.Capital. I'm wondering if you have any sort of advice for me and Rena and the rest of the community as we're trying to explore this design space and accelerate the creation of this parallel society.
Yeah, I think the biggest learning I've had, especially from building Deorg over the years, was starting simple. And there's this like urge amongst mechanism nerds to make the thing this magnus opum, like this really complex thing that you've thought about every little detail, and it's just going to be magical and like fix all the world's problems. And I've just worked with like dozens of projects that it's at T0. That's where they were at, and I've just only seen that go badly. And so I think I like the idea of competition and basically like trialing these small like in contained environments, these
Yeah.
different simple proposals rather than try to fold them together into like one Frankenstein. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think starting simple, it sounds simple, but yeah, I think many people don't.
Yeah. Chase, I had Chase Chapman on the Green Pill podcast like a year and a half ago, and she told me about Gall's law, which basically states that any complex system that works started as a simple system that works that evolved over time. And so I think it's a great reminder, especially since us mechanism designers love complexity so much that we need something simple that is explainable and then we can like evolve from there.
Yeah, that's from the Systems Theory Bible. I love that one. Gall's law is very useful.
And I also think that I love quadratic funding, but it's so fucking complex, especially when you have Sybil resistance and you got to tip up the matching pool. I have a new refined appreciation for just like simplicity in mechanism design because simplicity is elegance and it's bliss in some ways. And I think that if I could rebuild Gitcoin, I think I would start with like a simpler grants tool and then evolve quadratic funding, not go down the fucking deep end of quadratic funding and Sybil resistance and all of the warts and then try to re-engineer it from that. So yeah, it's been humbling, but it's a good reminder to start simple.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there has to be one core interesting thing to set something apart and make it, succeed. But there shouldn't be multiple really interesting things. And this is another problem is like projects that try to innovate on like multiple different vectors at once.
Yeah.
I like when projects are basically conservative on all of the vectors, do what has worked for everyone else. And then you just take one where you're like, okay, we're going to amp this up to 11 and no one's going to expect kind of what we're building in this part. And so, yeah, like in the DAO space, this just happened a lot with, we're building an innovative product and we fundraised in an innovative way. And our legal entity is this weird, innovative thing. And so then you're just like ping ponging across all these like unknowns at the same time.
I think that that's a great point. Innovating where your core strength is, and hopefully that's a high leverage point that the market cares about. I mean, I could say that like to me, like we said this at the Allo DAO proto DAO summoning on in February was we had this sign that said the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet. That's our North Star, at least the North Star that we landed on for now. And like my sort of vision is that like over the next year, 10 years, we're going to have 10x or 100x more tokenized assets as blockchains eat the world. And that those people are going to need to allocate capital. And therefore, the shelling, like having the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet will be an extremely valuable set of mechanisms or devices at that point. And so, I guess I'd love to volley to you, like, how do we reach that North Star? Well, first off, do you think that's a valuable North Star? And then second off, how do we reach it? The capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet.
Yeah, I think one of the critical ways to get there would be figuring out who has the most acute pain point that requires the better allocation mechanisms. Because sometimes like we can like innovate on better and better mechanisms, but who are the mechanisms for? And so I'm curious
Yeah.
if you envision like TradFi organizations being really into on-chain allocation mechanisms, or is it DAOs and we're scaling up the number of DAOs, or is it somehow, individuals or governments or something else?
I love this because you're starting with the audience and the customer, and that doesn't come natural to a lot of software engineers. To answer your question, like I view the design space of tokens, it's a multiple $1 trillion design space right now. And if we think that the world is going to be tokenized over the next 10 years, then there's $100 trillion worth of stocks, $100 trillion worth of commodities, a couple $1 trillion worth of currencies. And then you kind of go down the long tail of different types of assets from there. And, like until you get to like Web3 and DeFi, where like we're inventing new asset classes like meme coins, like and DAO governance tokens and protocol utility tokens that have never existed before. And so my sort of like view or like my hyperstition is that we're building these on-chain primitives, and right now they're for DAOs and for projects that are tokenized. And like there's kind of like, like a hipster cultural coding to like the Web3 space right now. But as Web3 like grows and we get older, so we're growing and we're getting older and more mature, and the old world's getting eaten by these blockchain systems, then I think these systems will eventually hit escape velocity and start to go mainstream, where like a stock like Microsoft with its tokenized could reward the developers in its developer program with an allocation of MSFT, but like the tokenized version. So that's sort of like a sketch of where I see things going. None of that shit is happening right now. So we should just start with assets that are already tokenized and solving problems for them. And I kind of think of like this is kind of what Gitcoin and Optimism and Mechanism Institute are already doing, is building useful ways for DAOs to solve their problems, which is primarily ecosystem growth right now and ecosystem effectiveness with capital allocation. So happy to have you respond to like the big picture there, or just like starting small with DAOs and already on-chain treasuries and working forward from there.
No, I think that works. Like having the current users or customers based on who's currently on chain, but then having the thesis of, okay, well, everything's coming on chain. And so as that tide rises, so will the market share or TAM, total addressable market of, allocation mechanisms. I had similar thoughts in the early days of DAOs, like in 2017, 2018. And I guess it didn't play out. It was early. So
Not
yeah,
yet.
I thought by
Yeah.
now we would have a lot more DAOs, but the DAO kind of, I think, value prop and mechanisms weren't kind of there to kind of support people going that route
Hmm.
instead of doing a trad or doing something off chain.
Yeah.
But with tokenization, I think we're very much seeing that in real time. Obviously, the past 2 years of meme coins, but more interestingly, the real world assets that are happening now. I mean, I spent a lot of this morning looking at all the different real estate tokenization projects. There's a cool website like rwa.xyz that has like all these metrics for all the different asset tokenization going on. And yeah, I just wanted to look into real estate because to me that's like the most trad world like concrete thing, right? That's like we all live somewhere. And so I thought that was like a good indicator for like what's actually, how fast is the on-chain stuff actually moving. And I don't think they have real estate tracked in their types, so I think it's very minuscule. But I did go to a bunch of the websites that were tagged as real estate, and there's a ton. And it's just quite interesting to see all of a sudden this floodgate opening of people just realizing, okay, well, it's easier to collect capital on chain and then return capital to investors on chain. The hard part's the legal. And so I think people have already realized this years ago. And so the legal work has now started to bear fruit. And so now you're seeing kind of the floodgates open with people, throwing assets on chain, raising money, allocating capital back to those who invested through, tokenization, and just throwing on chain the kind of like capital flows that were previously happening through wires and legal paperwork.
I feel like the sentiment around DAOs has never been worse, but DAOs have never been more effective than they are now, which is maybe not saying much because they've never been all that effective, except for like MakerDAO, which I think is a really elegantly designed system. But
Mhm.
it's just funny that the sentiment is so low, but it feels like they're becoming more effective all the time to me.
I think that the ones that worked are the ones that were very specialized around what they were set up to do and weren't these like broad mission driven ones. So like Maker is like hyper, you know, optimized around governing Maker and Compound, Uniswap, Aave, like the DeFi DAOs. And then you have like Moloch, and the kind of forks thereof. And yeah, I think the things that were built, purpose built, worked quite well. And that's how I think DAOs should be built, at least for the foreseeable future. I don't think we're ready for the kind of 2-click deploy DAO that I think that's just going to end up being less useful than having not done anything on chain at all.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the proposals that you submitted for the Allo DAO design contest and how they could support Allo's mission. The audience to this podcast is people who are involved in the Allo.Capital community, and would love to just like sort of land the plane by talking a little bit about your DAO design proposals and the ones that that you think can help us build this venture.
Yeah, so I submitted 3 different proposals. I tried to make very minimalist, like very just like focused on doing one thing very well. And I think the one that I'm most excited by is the feature key proposal, where the basic decision of which builders to fund, which mechanisms to fund, would be decided on through prediction markets. So there would be markets created for all of the different proposals, and then people could buy or sell like the success or failure token of each of those. And then through the basically pricing, the resultant pricing of those pass and fail tokens, that would actually trigger the decision of which projects get funding. I think this is cool because it's a way to surface dark horse talent and have like a curation mechanism that rewards people for going deep and finding out about someone that they think has a lot of potential, but that maybe the broader, audience, like, or voters would not necessarily have noticed. And that's what we've seen with prediction markets, like Polymarket, is that they're surprisingly accurate, even if they're pretty low volume, because there's a strong incentive if something is mispriced to do your own research and place a bet, right? And so I think that could be really cool and applied to allocation and very, cybernetic, like we talked about earlier, where it's just continuously causing the decisions to be made as a result of people's own self-interest, just working itself out, rather than needing to coordinate around a group of people voting on something.
So Rena and I just announced what we thought were the top proposals for the DAO design contest, and this one was selected as one. So really interested to see how we can take some capital and put it into a mechanism like this and use it to support Allo.Capital as it grows. So more to be said about how this is going to be implemented in practice, but I think we're excited to mess around here and to find out what kind of stuff can be created out of it. So thank you for the DAO design proposal, and congrats on getting selected, and looking forward to working together on that.
Thanks. Yeah, it was fun to work on.
One last question, which is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say?
No, I think we covered a lot. I think that I'd really encourage people to look at the mechanisms in the library, because a lot of thought and effort was put into making each one of them this kind of well thought out structure that can help actual builders use the mechanisms and systems they're building.
Yeah, so you can check that out at mechanism.institute. Is that the right URL?
Yep.
Cool. And where can we find you online?
Ori Shim on X. That's basically it.
We'll have a link on the show notes. Well, Ori, thanks for your involvement in Allo. Really admire you and your work on Mechanism Institute, and excited to co-create this world together in the future. So thanks again.
Likewise. Thank you.
Alrighty, we just heard from Ori Shimony of the Mechanism Institute. I am just really excited about all of the ideas that we talked about on this episode, and I think that we are going to create a brighter future together in our networked on-chain world, thanks to the work that Ori has done. Thanks again for listening to the Allo.Capital podcast. Again, we are featuring the people who are building the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet. Disclaimer, this podcast episode was for informative purposes only and is not financial advice. Do your own research. Do not make any financial decisions based off this podcast. In addition, I own crypto assets like ETH, DAI, USDC, and GTC. Well, I think this was a fun episode with Ori. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends. Please like, rate, and review. It really helps people out there find the work that we're doing to summon the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet and create a better foundation for collective action in the 21st century. So I hope that you enjoyed it. Peace and love. I will see you on the next one. Goodbye.